Welcome to WhiskyCast, cask strength conversation featuring news and interviews from the world of whiskey. I'm Mark Gillespie. This is episode number 671 for December 10th, 2017. Coming up in a few minutes.
To be fair, we probably talked each other into and out of the idea over and over, but every time I thought it was a bad idea, he was like, let's go for it. And every time she thought it was a terrible idea, I was like, oh, we can't not do this. And here we are, not being able to do it. So we're having a good time.
Rachel Gardner is one of the founders of Republic Restoratives Distillery in Washington, D.C. It's one of the few distilleries owned and run by women. And the other night, the distillery hosted a New York Times event looking at the history of women in distilling and brewing. We'll have that discussion and my conversation with Rachel Gardner coming up later on WhiskyCast In-Depth. I'll also have the calendar of events, this week's Your Voice, and the What I'm Tasting This Week department, all coming up on this week's WhiskyCast.
The holidays are a time to celebrate, to share something special with friends and family. This year, why not consider sharing something truly special? An engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnnywalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
WhiskyCast, brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
Let's get started with the week's news. It's brought to you by Highland Park. The tentative Brexit deal between Great Britain and the European Union is being viewed as good news in Ireland, where the drinks industry had been worried about the potential for a hard border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland after Great Britain leaves the EU in 2019. The deal calls for the current open border to remain after the breakup, and since the Irish whiskey industry operates on both sides of the border in many ways, that was a key point of concern. Barry Brothers and Rudd has increased its ownership stake in San Francisco-based Anchor Distilling. The London-based company bought out one of the partners in Anchor for an undisclosed amount. Anchor split off its brewing operations earlier this year in a deal with Japan's Sapporo Brewing, and plans to build a standalone distillery near its current facility in San Francisco's Potrero Hill neighborhood. Brown-Forman released its second quarter earnings report Wednesday. Global sales for Jack Daniel's, Woodford Reserve, and Old Forester whiskeys all posted significant gains. Net sales for the quarter were up by 10%, with international sales accounting for a large percentage of those gains. The company's shares gained 9.2% for the week at Friday's close of trading. Pernod Ricard is planning to start exporting 3 of its Indian whiskies for the first time. The Paris-based company has given its Indian unit the green light to start developing international markets for its Blender's Pride, Imperial Blue, and Royal Stag whiskies. They're hoping to tap into the demand for Indian whiskies created over the last few years by the Amrut, Paul John, and Ramper single malts. Not much to report in the way of new whiskies this week. Springbank has released its new local barley 10-year-old single malt. As you might guess from the name, the grain for this whiskey was grown by farmers near Campbellton. It's matured in a combination of bourbon and sherry casks and bottled at 57.3% ABV. It'll carry a recommended retail price of £86 a bottle. That's about $115 U.S. Meanwhile, Calgary's Kensington Wine Market is celebrating its 25th anniversary with a new 10-year-old Kilchoman single cask bottling. It's an ex-bourbon cask with a price tag of $200 Canadian. That's about $156 U.S. And Master of Malt has released a single cask Redbreast 16-year-old Irish single pot still whiskey. It was matured in a first fill Oloroso sherry butt and bottled at 60.2% ABV. The U.S. price, $155 a bottle. This week marked the anniversary of the repeal of Prohibition in the United States back in 1933. We've talked many times in the past about the role organized crime played in illegal alcohol distribution during that dark time in American history. If you're visiting Las Vegas, the Mob Museum will be opening a new permanent exhibition next April on the history of Prohibition, complete with a speakeasy. And finally, we have an update and a correction of sorts on last week's story about the bourbon-swilling opossum in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. As we reported, the opossum made it through the roof of a liquor store last month and knocked a bottle off the shelf. The bottle broke, the opossum licked up all of the liquor, and was found sleeping it off next to the broken glass in the morning. At the time, the store's owner told reporters it was a bottle of bourbon. He has now changed his story, and according to USA Today, says it was a bottle of cognac instead. As far as we know, the opossum is still doing well after being treated and released back into the wild. You can keep up with the latest whiskey news all week long at whiskycast.com. The news is brought to you by Highland Park, the Orkney single malt with Viking soul. The nights are long this time of year on Orkney, and there's a new Highland Park single malt that celebrates the darkness. Look for Highland Park's The Dark at a whiskey shop near you, or find out more at highlandparkwhiskey.com.
Redbreast fans have always cherished our whiskey's sherry notes, so we set out to embellish that character. Introducing the Redbreast Listowel edition, a quintessential single pot still Irish whiskey finished in first fill Oloroso sherry casks from Spain's prestigious Bodegas Listowel. Carrying Redbreast's trademark pot still spices and dark dried fruit notes, the Listowel edition is graced with an enduring sherry finish that would be better described as a final act. Discover the newest branch on the Redbreast family tree.
Last time around, we had the story of the annual Snowflake Limited Edition Single Malt Release Party at Stranahan's Distillery in Denver, Colorado. You can see more on that story now in the latest episode of WhiskyCast HD. It's available on YouTube and at iTunes, as well as at whiskycast.com. Now let's open up the inbox for this week's Your Voice, brought to you by Lot 40. Had a lot of comments on last week's episode and the Snowflake story, but this one from Shane Holden managed to comment on two stories at the same time. Mark, yet another great podcast. I really enjoyed the in-depth segment and the stories about the annual pilgrimage to the Stranahan's Distillery, having once made the journey there all the way from Manitoba, Canada, myself. Speaking of Manitoba and Diageo's Crown Royal Distillery located there, I also paid particular attention to the segment featuring Ewan Morgan and the most recent Orphan Barrel release, Entrapment, a bottle I've been immensely curious about since first hearing about it a while ago. When, in response to your question about why it isn't going to be released in Canada, he responded with, quote, "There isn't enough." I am fairly certain that is Diageo marketing speak for, quote, "No level-headed Canadian is going to spend $150 US on a 25-year-old Canadian whiskey watered down to 41% ABV. Especially this year in the wake of the Northern Border Collection's Wiser's 35-year-old at 50% ABV for $165 Canadian, or the Lot 40 cask strength at $70 Canadian. In the States, however... Anyway, just my 2 cents. Thanks again for all you do for the industry and for keeping me forever entertained on my daily runs. Glad to help Shane, and thanks for the note. Len Eckstein of Colorado's Deerhammer Distilling added this note to my Facebook Live preview from last Saturday morning. Nice, Mark, but in just 2 hours' drive from where you currently stand, you can get to some of Colorado's finest distilleries in the mountains. It's not much colder up here, currently 26 degrees Fahrenheit in Buena Vista, Colorado, and there are no lines. I know, Len. I'll try to get down that way the next time I'm in Colorado. Now, one of my favorite all-time desserts is the Scottish classic sticky toffee pudding. And Armand Antomaria, at @ANtomaria on Twitter, tweeted this along with a photo the other day. Rye on rye sticky toffee pudding. Rye, flour, and whiskey, as well as dates, coffee, and orange zest from the new at 177 Milk Street cookbook. We saved you a slice. Man, I'm really jealous right now. At Phil Catalane in New York City tweeted this question. Hey, WhiskyCast. My coworker got a bottle of Haig & Haig from the 1970s. There's some white stuff floating in the bottle. Safe to drink? It doesn't look like it's been opened. I have no idea where it's spent the past 4 decades, though. Well, I told Phil that my best guess is that bottle appears to have not been opened. The white stuff is probably some of the chemical compounds from the whiskey that came out of solution over the years and formed crystals on top of the liquid. I don't think that would make it unsafe to drink, but it couldn't hurt to filter out the crystals first through a coffee filter. And, of course, if it smells a bit off, don't drink it. Of course, I could be wrong, and I told Phil that the advice is free, so take it for what it's worth, and I'm not responsible if anyone gets sick after drinking the stuff. So far, no reports of that happening yet. If you have a question, a suggestion, or anything else you'd like to share with whiskey lovers around the world, you can always post it on the Your Voice page at whiskycast.com. You can also find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. And if you'd like to hear your question on the show, just record a voice memo on your smartphone and email it to us. The address is comments@whiskycast.com. This week's Your Voice is brought to you by Lot 40, Canada's award-winning 100% pot still rye whiskey. Lot 40, unapologetically Canadian. Please drink responsibly. Time now for the WhiskyCast calendar of events. Santa Claus will be stopping at Buffalo Trace Distillery on December 15th and 16th. And no, you can't sit on Santa's lap and ask for a bottle of Pappy Van Winkle for Christmas. The Relish and Whiskey Muskoka tasting is on December 15th in Huntsville, Ontario. The Virginia Craft Spirits Roadshow is on the 16th at A. Smith Bowman Distillery in Fredericksburg, Virginia. Julio's Liquors in Westboro, Massachusetts has a Glen Murray Scotch tasting on the 21st. Villa Conthor in Limburg, Germany has a whiskey and craft beer tasting on December 28th, along with an Ardbeg tasting the next night. After the holidays, the San Antonio Cocktail Conference is January 10th through the 14th. The Harrow Whiskey Festival is January 12th and 13th in London. And, of course, I'll be in Victoria, British Columbia for the annual Victoria Whiskey Festival, January 18th through the 21st. As always, we'll have special coverage that weekend here on WhiskyCast. Right now, we have 107 different events on our searchable calendar at whiskycast.com. If you have an event coming up, just use the contact form on our website and let us know all about it.
You don't need a special occasion to open a bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label. But when you have a special occasion, why not celebrate with a specially engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label? Here's how one whiskey lover celebrated his team's recent success. He arranged to have 108 specially engraved bottles of Johnnie Walker Blue Label made for his co-workers. You might say he hit a home run. Just like a perfectly executed double play, Johnnie Walker Blue Label is smooth and well-rounded, and unlike a trophy, never needs polishing. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
Johnnie Walker Blue Label Blended Scotch Whiskey, 40% alcohol by volume. Imported by Diageo North America, Norwalk, Connecticut. Please drink responsibly.
This week's WhiskyCast In-Depth is brought to you by Lagavulin. Last time around, I mentioned that Scotland's Glenwivis distillery was likely the first distillery to be successfully constructed with a crowdfunding campaign. I should have said Scotland's first distillery, And that's because Rachel Gardner and Pia Carasoni also used a successful crowdfunding campaign to build their Republic Restoratives distillery in Washington, D.C. It's one of the few women-owned distilleries around and is laying down its own stocks of bourbon and brandy for future releases while bottling the Burrow bourbon, Rodham Rye whiskey, and other spirits from sourced stock. Thursday night, the distillery was the site of a New York Times-sponsored event on the history of women in distilling and brewing, called Women in Whiskey, Sisters in Suds. And it was timed to coincide with the anniversary this past week of Prohibition's repeal in the United States. Rachel Gardner was on that panel, and we'll have the discussion in just a few minutes. But first, I wanted to talk to her about the decision that she and Pia made to get out of their career comfort zones and open a distillery.
Distilling is not your background, is it?
No, not specifically. I think Pia and I both spent a lot of time as makers. Pia was a chef for a while in San Francisco, and I spent much of my youth making maple syrup with my grandparents on our family farm. But the idea of getting into distillation really came out of a love for whiskey. And I think 9 years ago now, in the wintertime, Pia and I were up at my grandparents' farm, snow everywhere, and we kind of were thinking about what we wanted to do with the rest of our lives and sort of having that strange late 20s existential crisis. We were drinking bourbon, and we were like, oh man, this place would be a really cool brewery. We're like, we could totally grow barley up here, and we sort of went on one of those late night drinking tirades. And the conversation about opening a brewery or distillery slowly kind of became more and more sober and got closer and closer to daylight. And finally, I guess it was in 2011, we were like, we should actually really do this. And then we started researching more about the industry. I took a master distiller class from this wonderful man named Rusty Figgins in Seattle. We went to Moonshine University in Kentucky, and we just started to learn as much as we possibly could about the process, the industry, and what it would take to build a space in an urban area.
And then you still went ahead with it.
Well, to be fair, we probably talked each other into and out of the idea over and over, but every time I thought it was a bad idea, Pia was like, let's go for it. And every time she thought it was a terrible idea, I was like, oh, we can't not do this. And here we are, not being able to do it. So we're having a good time.
Let's talk about the whiskeys now. Because you're making bourbon and rye. And let's talk about the Rodham Rye, because that's the one that sort of put you on the map. You didn't originally distill this one, though, did you?
No, we did not. So we try to be extremely transparent about our processes, and if you get a chance to see our tasting room, you'll notice we have glass on all sides. We're really about trying to educate consumers about not only our products, but about what the industry is doing, as well as make it seem like there's less smoke and mirrors and people are free to ask questions. So with all the whiskeys that we have put out so far, these are not products that we have distilled ourselves, but we really tried to make them our own. So with our first aged spirit, we put out our Burrow bourbon, which was a 5-year-old Kentucky straight bourbon whiskey that we finished in some white wine barrels. They were French oak. They had Chardonnay in them for 6 years and Sauvignon Blanc for 9 months, and we thought it might make for an interesting aging profile, but it was a bit of a risk. But we thought we would take these early years before our own spirits that we've been distilling already, that we would do some barrel experimentation on finishing. But early on, we made a promise to each other that we would never put anything into a bottle that we wouldn't drink ourselves every day. Neither of us are fans of moonshine, so that's why we don't sell moonshine. That's not to say that there isn't a big market for it, but for us, we're really trying to make a consistent flavor profile across all of our products, which is smooth mouthfeel, approachable to the palate, but also accessible in terms of your expectations for what that product should taste like. So vodka, we want our vodka to be neutral. Bourbon, we want it to be sweet. Rye, we want it to be a little spicy. And with our apple brandy, we were just trying to kind of make something that was a little bit unique and all our own. It's our first orchard to glass product, and it was in partnership with a local orchard that we were very excited to work with. So this is one of many future brandy experiments, I would guess.
And let's get back to that Rodham Rye, though, because you managed to skip over that one.
Oh, I did. I managed to skip over it. So the Rodham Rye is a blend of 2 whiskeys that we source. So we've worked with a series of brokers and sort of pounded the pavement looking for interesting whiskeys that weren't the standard whiskey everybody else was sourcing. And in doing that, ended up finding a really fun Tennessee rye that we felt was a little bit spicy, and then another one that we thought was even more exciting, and been blending the 2 together and letting them sit in a barrel for about 8 months. We think we made a unique whiskey that nobody else is making because it's a blend, but we're really understanding now that the process of blending is an art form in its own, and we're learning a lot from other master blenders like Nancy Fraley and other folks that really have been giving us guidance along the way, and we're just doing our best to trust our own palates and ask as many questions as possible.
Like what? What's Nancy taught you? Because she's an old friend of the show.
Oh, she's great. So she actually gave me some great feedback on the the apple brandy early on, but she has been very generous with trying our products and letting us know. I mean, she's very candid and doesn't really mince words, so you get a quick thumbs up, thumbs down, but the follow-up to that is some more complex tasting notes around, this is spicy, this is sweet, this is a direction that you could go with this. Are you, how long are you letting your apple brandy rest on the lees? We really got some great feedback from her, and I think in general we're really looking towards local bartenders and our customers and tastemakers to give us the feedback on the products and not just have it be the two of us sitting in a room alone being like, well, this tastes good. So we really try to make sure that it's what people want and not just what we want.
Your still is unique. I've never seen a still quite like this one, and I'm going to have to get a photo of it on the website for people to look at because that thing is a thing of beauty. I've never seen one quite like it.
It is. It's a gorgeous feast. Like any distiller will tell you their own still they love and probably have moments where they hate it because they're all finicky. But early on, we got some great feedback in polling as many distillers as we could and listening to your show that the biggest regrets of emerging craft distillers were that they either had too small of a still, they didn't have a long enough lease or own their space, and that they were really wishing that they had gone bigger earlier and made that investment because very quickly you outgrow your equipment. So in an effort to go big early, we got a 1,000-gallon distillation system, but we had it separated in 2 kettles of 500 gallons. And part of the logic behind that was to reduce our heat up time. So rather than trying to heat up 1,000 gallons at once, we heat 2 500-gallon kettles at the same time. We cut that heat up time by almost 2/3. But the stills are unique. They are a stainless steel system. They are a hybrid set, so we've got a kettle-column combination, but the column itself has close to 100 square feet of copper within it, and it's a series of bubble plates that have these nested copper caps within them. So we get the majority of the benefit of the copper where it really matters, which is when the spirit's in vapor form.
And what are you making in it now?
So right now we are making bourbon and we are making brandy predominantly. That is our focus these days. Lots of bourbon. Bourbon is where people are most excited, but certainly rye whiskey, and we're looking at moving into the single malt realm as well. We think that that's going to be certainly an emerging product, and there's a lot of new fun malts to play with. So we've recently received a little mini still that we're going to play with some recipes on and see what our next product might be.
When do you think you'll bottle your first bourbon?
It's that pinky swear pact to each other that we wouldn't put anything in a bottle before it was ready, and unfortunately many craft distillers have to rush, and so we're doing our best to bridge that amount of time with our Civic Vodka and the other curated whiskeys in our series, but I expect somewhere around 2022, 2023, if it's ready, but who knows? We'll wait and see. What's the biggest mistake you made? For all those other craft distillers out there, what's the biggest mistake you made that somebody who's coming in could learn from? I mean, we've made so many mistakes. I think the biggest mistake we made early on was assuming that it was going to be easy to finance this project. If you don't have, a giant fortune behind you or a legacy of many generations in this industry, it is tough to find the funds to do this. And unfortunately, most banks don't see whiskey in a barrel with its accruing value as something that is really a commodity that you can monetize and collateralize. So we early on thought, we got a little big for our britches, I suppose, went to banks and said, hey, we need, $2 million. And they said, that's hilarious. Come back when you've made $10 million. So we were very lucky early on to do a crowdfunding campaign and get some really great, some great feedback and support from people that know us and people that don't. And so we had, I think, close to 600 online supporters that helped us get the seed money to really prove our brand. And then we were able to go to some smaller venture capital folks and get some private investors to help us along the way. But just like everybody else, we're, going bill to bill, and we're just hoping to keep the lights on. Beats the real work, though, doesn't it? Oh, yeah. And thankfully, most of the fundraising is the job of my business partner, who's fantastic at that work. So I spend most of my day disconnecting hoses and pumps and bottling product.
The issue of financing came up during the panel discussion, which was led by Jennifer Steinhauer of the New York Times, along with Rachel Gardner, Julie Verratti of Denizens Brewing Company in the D.C. suburb of Silver Spring, Maryland, and author Garrett Peck, who has written about the history of Prohibition in Washington, D.C. There was a full house at the distillery that night with around 200 people on hand, and the New York Times graciously agreed to let us record the discussion for this week's WhiskyCast.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us this evening here in beautiful Ivy City. This is going to be an interesting discussion about the history of women in the brewing and distilling industries. I'm Jennifer Steinhauer. I'm Director of Live Journalism for the New York Times here in Washington, D.C., and this is our last live event for the year, so we're very excited to have you here. I want to give a special welcome to our New York Times subscribers. You truly do make our journalism happen, so thank you. So the truth is that women have played an important role in the creation and distribution of alcohol since ancient times. Anthropologists have noted evidence of women brewing in Mesopotamia, and the Egyptian goddess Hathor was a beer maker. She had the moniker of the mistress of intoxication. You thought you were just going to taste things. You're learning things. You know things now. So women in the first centuries of Egypt worked as alchemists, which sort of presaged our contemporary distilling processes. And you fast forward many centuries later into the United States, women have played vital roles in the making and the selling of alcohol, and then they played the most important role in banning alcohol through Prohibition, and then actually helped put the 21st Amendment, which was ratified this week in 1933, over the line. People of D.C. will appreciate the premise of that was about home rule. There you go. So we're going to talk about the historic role of women and the women working in contemporary times and kind of tie it all together. And joining me to do that is my panel, Rachel Gardner, who is a co-founder of this beautiful distillery here, female-owned Republic Restoratives. Come on out. Come on out. Julie Verratti is co-founder of the also female-owned Denizens Brewing Company. And Garrett Peck, historian and author of many books, including Prohibition in Washington, D.C. Please welcome our panel. So just to let you know what we're going to do, we're going to chat among ourselves here for about 30 minutes, and then we will open it up to a few questions from you all, and then you'll be able to repair to our tasting stations to try some products, both beer and whiskey, and talk more with our panelists extensively about the history of all things women and alcohol. And Garrett will also be in the tasting room answering more questions and signing books. So let's get right into it. We're here because of we're talking about the 21st Amendment, but obviously we can't talk about that before we talk about Prohibition. And I think that when people think about women and alcohol, they think of Prohibition, and they think of it as this very, buttoned-up sort of uptight movement. But isn't it also true, Garrett, that it's not a coincidence that the Prohibition movement was basically concurrent with the suffrage movement, and that, in fact, this was viewed as a woman's movement in the United States? What can you tell us about that?
Yeah, absolutely. Prohibition and temperance were tied just like that. There was actually a political alliance between the temperance movement, led by the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which had at its peak 600,000 women were members, and the suffrage movement, which was much, much smaller. And I think the suffragists at one point realized, you know what, if we ally ourselves with the temperance movement, we can each get our way. And thus, in 1920, we got both Prohibition and women got the vote. That happened. That's not an accident of history. There was a political alliance that made that happen. The other thing I do want to remind everyone about these two movements, this was not a conservative movement. This was a progressive movement. This was about improving American society and protecting American families. So their idea of let's have a dry society, this was about progress.
Julie, I think you had a family member, right, who was part of the Prohibition, the temperance movement. Isn't that correct?
I did. My great-grandmother, Millie Preston, from Monmouth County, New Jersey, the Marlborough Township, for those of you who are familiar with it. She was the head of the Women's Christian Temperance Movement chapter there, and now I own a brewery, so sorry, Millie.
So is that the ultimate rebellion, or do you find some sort of symmetry in there?
I'd say it's more of a rebellion.
Okay, then. That's right. And when you think about these movements, Rachel, how do you view it? Do you feel that brewing and distilling have a feminist framework, or what's your kind of historic sense of it?
It's interesting. I think whenever you're talking about food and beverage, you're always talking about women. The kitchen is at the core of the household, and drinking is often at the core of socializing, at least in modern society. And so I think we're seeing more women involved in this industry, not only because of their exceptional palates, but also because women tend to be at the core of family socializing. And so whether you're out at a bar, you're at home, women are often the ones that are pouring the wine.
And we're going to talk about those palates because that's some of this is actual biological fact, right? We're going to get there, trust me. So let's go on to the 21st Amendment. So how did we get from women kind of being the anchors of temperance to assisting in that?
So again, there was this alliance between the suffrage and the temperance movements, right? Well, that alliance fell apart in the 1920s for the key reason that young women decided now that it was illegal for everyone to drink, therefore we can equally break the law and go out to speakeasies and starting to cut our hair and bobbing our hair and wearing short skirts and whatnot. So the younger generation of women did not embrace the whole idea of temperance. So the 1920s is this really, really fascinating period, really kind of our first sexual revolution in our country, where women really stepped out to the fore and began drinking and also smoking cigarettes and stuff. And so women also then played a key role in the undermining of Prohibition and then also ultimately in the 21st Amendment, because the Women's Christian Temperance Union had claimed that they spoke for women. And then by the late 1920s, other organizations had popped up like WANPR that also spoke for women and said, "Nah, you don't speak for us. We think prohibition's a bad thing and we think it should be repealed."
I guess we shouldn't skip over that little interregnum to talk about female bootleggers and the interesting role they played. Isn't it true that in a sense it was easier for women to play those roles because the authorities didn't want to necessarily mess with them, mess with their livelihood, pat them down when they? What was that like? What was the role of women in bootlegging?
Yeah, women certainly played a role in this. For example, a woman could hide a flask in her garter. I mean, no policeman wants to go frisk unless you work for TSA or something, right?
Do you guys have flasks in your garters? I just need to ask that. Is that personal or?
I need to check my garter.
Okay.
Yeah, so it was probably easier for a lot of women to transport products, for example. Men were more likely to get caught. That said, there certainly were a number of women-run speakeasies. For example, in New York City, there was a very famous one that was run by a woman named Tex Guinan. She was this larger-than-life figure. And when her patrons came in, she would always greet them all, "Hello, suckers." And they understood it was a joke, right?
Again, I need to stop and just interject. Hello, suckers. No one said that to me when I came in. Do you think you could work that into your program?
The door woman didn't say that to you already. Anybody else?
Do you have an equivalent of hello, suckers?
No.
Okay.
No. I think we try to welcome everyone.
You need to work on that. Okay.
Not us either.
Yeah. Are there, when you hear, you must know about the history that he's talking about here. Do you guys have role models, either historically or in contemporary distilling and brewing? People you think about that kind of have inspired you or that inspire you even creatively?
So I'll start. When you think about beer, a lot of times you just think about guys. There are actually it's a pretty large population of women that work in and around the beer industry in this country. A lot of brewers, a lot of brewery owners. And so I feel lucky to be in this industry in this day and age where there are a lot of people that I can look up to, that I can network with, that I can learn from. And it is a welcoming industry. I mean, considering the number, and if you look at just the demographics of the folks that are in the industry, being mostly men, it is extremely welcoming to people from all backgrounds. And that's something that I really love about being in beer. And that's been my experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think you'll often discover that craft distilling tracks about 10 years behind craft brewing. So we're working out our way out of our infancy. But at this point, I would say there are more women in craft brewing than there are in craft distilling. There are a handful of women that I would say really stand out in both of our industries, one being Nancy Fraley, who is known industry-wide as the Nose, and she truly, the Nose knows, and she is a master taster, master blender. She has her hands in many different products and judging competitions, but she is someone who, unlike many of her counterparts, will give literally any single person her time to share with them feedback on their products and really mentor people aside from taking her class. I mean, she really is somebody that is the mother of the industry in many ways, at least modern times.
I do want to return to women's noses because that is an important thing here, but I want to pick up on your beer thought for a second with men because part of it with beer is that beer has traditionally been marketed to men, right? We know about Super Bowl and women in bathing suits, and I mean, has that changed at all? Since that's been such a huge element of the beer industry, where do you see that going, and what's going on with that?
First of all, you're right. It has traditionally been marketed towards men, and using sex to sell. I will say in the most recently, so the Brewers Association, which is the national trade organization for small and independent breweries across the country, Denizens is an active member. I was actually just recently elected to the board, so I start my seat in February, which I'm very excited about. Just this past year, we created a diversity committee, and we also created new guidelines, basically saying if you create a beer that is offensive in any way, shape, or form, whether it's through its name or it's the marketing that you use for it or it's the packaging that you use for it, you're no longer going to be able to use the Brewers Association trademarks. You can't put their stuff, if you win a medal, you're not going to be able to put that on your product because they don't want to be associated. And I think that is a huge step in the direction of making sure that the beer industry, at least in the U.S., is standing by women and standing by diversity and trying to move away from just marketing to men and using sort of those, in my opinion, immature ways to sell products.
Are you one of the only women on the board?
I will be. I'm not the only. There's actually, I think there's going to be about 4 of us. Don't quote me on that. I got to double check, but I think there's going to be 4 of us.
I'll be quoting you tomorrow. Front page story in the New York Times. So let's talk about women in the history of DC, because that's kind of a special thing in terms of their behind the scenes. There were some interesting characters too in relationship to distilling, but also, frankly, to tavern owning, correct? Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that.
Yeah. One of my favorite characters I've written about was a 23-year-old widow named Catherine Dentz, and she was a German immigrant and whose husband had died, and he had run a brewery, essentially a brew pub in Georgetown. And she had to keep the lights on and feed these 2 small children as a 23-year-old, right? Just incredible. And so I included a chapter in my, a subchapter in my capital beer book called The Fantastic Mrs. Dentz. And she actually got in trouble a fair number of times, and largely because she was selling booze on the weekends, especially on Sunday, given that you're supposed to be in church, right? Not out drinking beer and whatnot. So even though she'd have the door closed, but people could come in through the side door, a very common thing that would happen in saloons. And so she kept getting arrested and fined, and then her attorney would bail her out, and then she'd get arrested for selling a cigar on Sunday, and so on. So it really struck me what a huge burden this woman had. She's trying to keep this whole thing together, a family-run business with 2 small children, no husband, and the law is not on her side. They keep beating her up over this issue,
Did she kind of set a path, or do you think she was sort of an aberration?
Well, she did both, right? You don't see many women brewers after her. This was the era, this is the 1870s, right, when there were still a lot of mom and pop brewers around at the time, but by the 1870s, 1880s, it had all consolidated into these big mammoth 100,000 barrel a year operations, and this is the Gilded Age. Mm-hmm. And really the family brewers got squeezed out. And it really wasn't, I don't think until after Prohibition was over, just in within all of our collective memory, that women started really becoming brewers again.
So if you kind of contextualize that, right now in current times, what are some of the challenges? I mean, I read about a company recently, maybe some of you heard about this, I don't remember what the company was, where the women made a fake male partner to approach investors through email. What do you think about that? This is something that all female entrepreneurs face in this country, in every industry. What specifically do you experience as women in this industry vis-a-vis investors and basically supports for your business?
I guess I'll take that one first. My background is predominantly in the mining and natural resource industry, so I spent a solid decade dealing with a predominantly male-dominated field. So now living in both an urban area and sort of in this urban craft movement, there are a lot more women involved than I would have anticipated or relative to my previous life. But we did note early on, especially in the fundraising stage, in going to banks and speaking with other industry professionals. Pia, my co-founder, and I would show up to a meeting with our now sales guy, Whit, And every time they'd say, so tell me about your business, Whit. Just tell me the story. And he'd be like, well, it's really these two ladies. And so it often came as a surprise to people. And we would usually see people put themselves in check very quickly. They'd feel guilty for addressing the man in the room. But I would say 9 out of 10 times that still happens if we go into the meeting, the three of us, which is shocking. I mean, he pulls his own weight, no doubt, but the two of us, we've been planning this for many, many years and did the majority of the legwork on raising the money, and it's just interesting to see people immediately turn towards the man in the room and say, great job.
This is not an unknown experience.
For anyone.
Right. That definitely happens to us as well. I will say, though, I sometimes have a hard time answering this question because I am a female, but I am a little bit more masculine presenting, so I don't think I necessarily get impacted quite as much as my business partner, Emily, who's my wife. She's very feminine, and she also works at the tap room a lot more than I do because I do the wholesale for the company, so I'm out and about, visiting accounts and whatnot. And I can't tell you how many times she's relayed this story to me, and I've seen it happen as well. Someone will come in who's a vendor who's trying to sell us something, and she's there. Hi, can I help you? Yeah, I need to speak to the owner. You're talking to her. No, I need to speak to the actual owner. Statements like that. And usually people get it pretty quickly, but it's sort of this, like, you see their head kind of like shake a little bit, like, oh, wait, oh, okay, you're the owner? It's, I want to talk to you. So that does happen. We had the exact same experience with banks where we had one bank. So first of all, when we were applying for loans, 10 banks told us don't even bother applying because we're not interested. One bank invited us in. We sat down, and the guy said, I just wanted to meet you. This was the best business plan I've ever read. You should go on Shark Tank and apply. Which was just, honestly, just a dumb idea. In general, it's like, we haven't even signed a lease yet, and you want us to go on Shark Tank? That's crazy. But it was, I guess I say that story to sort of say there was a sense of not being taken quite as seriously, which you had to sort of get over. Luckily we're, a little bit further along in our business, so we don't have it quite as much. But I do think there's some of that underlying, struggles that we have to deal with for that.
So what about taking the business person out of it and talk about the barkeep? What can you tell us about roles of women being the bartenders? Was that an advantage, a disadvantage historically in a tavern?
Well, I guess we had to go way back, probably to the 1700s, where women were barkeeps. There was a long, long period then when women were not allowed in bars. I mean, women could come into the side entrance, the ladies' entrance, to fill a growler for their husbands, and then had to leave. You see all the photos and stuff from Prohibition, and there's very few women bartenders.
Which is so interesting because if you read this story about women on these ships, they were drinking whiskey, they were preparing whiskey. I mean, again, as I mentioned in the beginning of the program, so many women were making these drinks and serving them in ancient times. It's funny with this period of American history where they weren't serving it. What do you find now? Do you notice anything particular about women behind the bar that's distinct in how they interact with customers, or what that means in a business way?
I mean, I can only speak to my own experience. I never bartended in my life prior to owning this establishment, and still most of our bartenders would prefer that I don't. But in our early days, we had a predominantly, almost exclusively male bar staff, and many of the women who are our Indiegogo supporters, and their names are on the wall, would come in here and say, hey, I thought this was supposed to be a woman-owned and operated distillery. And I was like, well, all of these gentlemen say you're welcome. They're all here to serve you. Enjoy yourselves. But as we have built the bar team and it has become more diversified by being populated by women, Emily, who now runs our bar, thank you, Emily, we are, I think, discovering that many more women feel comfortable in our space. We find a lot of women that come here for blind dates specifically. And I think part of that is just the culture, both of our male and female bartenders, where they feel comfortable in our space. They know that they are being respected, honored, and that we have clean bathrooms with superior toilet paper, I've been told.
They really like your toilet paper. That's really working for you. I think you
Spare
should
no
think about that for an ad. Just keep thinking. There's some interesting, and you alluded to this earlier, physical attributes to women that have helped them in the industry. I noticed that women were preferred for bottling because they had smaller hands and they were actually more nimble at that. I've read, and you guys must have heard this, that women have more olfactory glands, right? That actually in the whiskey industry are considered to be superior noses, and you can explain to the group what that is. How the nose works. Did these little things come up through history in terms of women's physical assets? And we did talk about the fact that their dresses are really good for bootlegging.
I think largely it's a pretty contemporary issue. I think once brewing and distilling left the house, women were, for most of history, it was women who made our beer, who made our wine, who made our products. And once it left the house and became commercial, and then now it's a man's product. And it was the men who were making the stuff and men who were serving it and whatnot. So I don't think it's really until the mid-20th century you start seeing women finally stepping up and being able to be bartenders and to be tasters and to be distillers and brewers. And everything that a man can do, a woman can do as well, including serve in the military. It's seriously.
And how much of that, like so many industries during and after World War II, was just because men weren't around to do those things? Was that important?
Yeah, that's a huge factor. World War II is, and World War I as well. The fact that we drafted so many men to go off and fight the war. Well, you still got to get all the industries. You got to make all the tanks and the airplanes and whatnot. So women stepped up big time and worked in the factories and did what was formerly considered to be a man's job, and they did it just as well as the men did.
And does this ring a bell to you guys, besides obviously thinking that what you do is better than what men do here in the District of Columbia with your products? Do you think that, is there any kind of, do you have that sense? I mean, do you learn about that, about the nose, for example? Can you talk to the audience about that? Because that's such an important part of distilling.
Oh, that's me. I'd be happy to answer that question then. And just to speak a little bit to what Garrett said, because he truly is the historical expert here, so I should not speak to any of the laws of these fantastic stories of women in our industry. But from an actual biological sense, women have more olfactory receptors than men do. And many tests have been done and studies to prove that women and men of the same age, women possess more than men do. So as we age, we lose our sense of taste and smell. The more hot sauce and coffee we consume over time dulls those senses. But they say that women have, to start with, 20,000 more olfactory receptors, which should make us not only better noses and better tasters, but also master blenders and better at trying to create higher amplitude in flavor so that the masses will enjoy them. But speaking of what you said before about women being involved in this industry until it's sort of pushed out of the home, I did want to touch on the fact that I do think it's about scale, and it's true with anything, whether it's education, being a kindergarten teacher versus a college professor. People are surprised to see women doing things at scale. That's when it's shocking, and it shouldn't be. And so much of what we are both trying to do is show that scale is possible and push ourselves as far as we can so that our scale grows to make room for other women involved.
Are there places that are getting like a model for that in Kentucky or elsewhere that you see where women are playing these roles in these really large businesses? And Garrett, you may know about that too. I mean, it seems like some of the distilleries in Kentucky actually have women in key roles at this point.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
And do you find that when you travel that you're seeing women in these positions?
I would say more and more. I mean, companies like Brown-Forman and Jim Beam, the big historical companies, have more and more women involved at higher levels now, definitely.
Yeah, I mean, just in the beer industry, I don't really know much about distilling, so I can't really speak to that. But New Belgium is owned and operated by a woman, and they're one of the largest independent breweries in the country. I think that's pretty awesome.
So I just want to, and if you can find a way to bring this around to women, I will applaud you. But I just want to stop for a second and talk about two issues that are really big in Washington and that generally divide Republicans and Democrats, which are taxes and regulation. But when it comes to the booze business, I think members of both parties pretty much have historically agreed that the laws concerning regulations and taxation for liquor are basically bad shit, right? So how can you sort that out for us, especially now that we're looking at a big tax bill that very likely will be signed by the president? You've been an advocate for changing tax laws for smaller breweries, correct? there are so many, everything being in the hands of the state, and you can talk a little bit about this too, the history of how we came to have such a bizarre patchwork of regulations and taxes for liquor that still remain in some ways that would be absolutely surprising, I think, to people, especially in tasting rooms, correct?
So yes, I am an advocate for trying to change some of the tax laws on alcohol businesses. It's funny, this current tax bill that's going through, it's extremely regressive in a lot of ways, and I disagree with the majority of it. However, if you look at what they're doing for alcohol excise taxes, it's actually one of, if not the only progressive part of that tax bill. Because what it will do is cut excise taxes in half for the smallest of the small breweries. Because currently, we pay the exact same tax rate that Budweiser pays when we make alcohol, which is insane. They spill in literally 60 seconds what we make in an entire year in terms of the amount of alcohol we make. So the fact that we're paying the same tax rate is kind of bananas. And so that, in excise taxes in general, and I'm sure Garrett will correct me if I'm wrong here, but as far as my understanding goes, is they were actually created during the Civil War era to help pay for the war. And they were created, and then the government was getting a lot of these funds from taxes. They just sort of stuck around, and they've been around since then. And so it hasn't changed in a very long time in terms of the tax rate. And so that is something that I think will help this sector grow and help especially the smallest of the small breweries, as well as distilleries and wineries in this country.
And there are some things that are specific to distilling too, correct? And patchwork.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I won't get into the details of how complex the tax law is, but currently from a federal perspective, we pay close to $14 per gallon, so per case that we sell, costs us $13.95 in taxes, and the proposed tax law will cut that by 80% for craft distilleries. So until we reach a volume of production which would exceed the capacity of this space about fivefold, we would then be subject to that $13.95 tax rate again, or $13.50 tax rate. So we are very much looking forward to that passing, but again, I disagree with 99.9% of what's in that tax bill. So
same.
But this is not an accident of history, right? Or is it? I mean, we have these bizarre patchwork laws, and some of the I think isn't it here that you have a little piece of tape on the floor that really
yes,
does stem from Prohibition?
Piece of duct tape on the floor that is our federal delineation between our bonded space, which is what you're sitting within right now, where the government is basically forcing us to protect their revenue, so we have to pay a bond every year to protect $60,000 worth of spirit. And every time we move spirit over that line, that is a taxable incident in which we have to then pay the government when we move it literally over the duct tape.
It's truly duct tape. It really is, people. You can see it. So can you just walk us through, we don't want to have like a huge tax lesson here, but I mean, this is a weird sort of thing of our history that continues to impact our broader tax policies as Americans, correct?
Yeah, absolutely. And this all goes back to the 21st Amendment and the repercussions from the 21st Amendment. That's the repeal amendment. And it gave the states the power to regulate alcohol for the first time. So really this is federalism at work. So each state then could decide how they wanted to regulate alcohol, and so they all came up with different ways, different tax structures. Most of the states adopted what's called the three-tier system of distribution. But some states, like I live in Virginia, I have to go to a state-run store, which is like going to a Soviet Union store to buy liquor. I can go to the grocery store to buy beer and wine. It's bizarre. And each state had to make that decision, right? So many of our laws really date to 1934. And over time, we've seen change happen. For example, at the breweries here in D.C., you can now sell a pint. You can sell pints. Oh, you've got a brew pub, so of course you can sell pints and all. Yep. And that's because consumers chafed at these rules, and they demanded change. So the fact that we speak up, that's what elicits change over time. But in 1934, there was a huge amount of distrust in the marketplace against alcohol, especially against distilled spirits. And thus, the tax was jacked up really, really high. The distilled spirits tax in particular, that's what paid for the New Deal. That was the new form of revenue during the Great Depression, and that's how we got the Golden Gate Bridge and all these other things funded, was through distilled spirits taxes.
Did any of that have to do with women?
Women voted very strongly for the 21st Amendment.
Okay, there we go.
Could I make an effort to bring it back to women for just one moment?
Please.
Muriel Bowser, the mayor of our fine city, basically has allowed us to have the most progressive liquor laws in the entire country. So I'm sorry you're in Maryland, but for us it is pretty fantastic. For breweries, and
I
for
like Maryland. Thank
I know
you.
too. I like it too, and
You're in Montgomery County, even harder.
But in DC, for wineries and breweries, you have the ability to go into one of those places and try beer and wine as you would consume it at home. But for distilled spirits, for as long as anyone can remember, any taste you were allowed to receive was a quarter-ounce pour of a lukewarm version of just that spirit. So I don't know how many of you drink gin or whiskey just neat all the time, but it is not the best way to showcase your product and showing people how they can use it at home, show bartenders how they could use it in their bars. And so DC allowed us to make cocktails. And so our bar up front is literally a tasting room where you have the opportunity to taste everything that we have in the form of a cocktail or however you would like it. And Muriel Bowser has done a great job at pushing that for us to equalize breweries, wineries, and distilleries in this industry.
If there's someone here who drinks their gin neat, I'm going to talk to you outside afterwards. I just want to meet you. So we're going to open up to a few questions before we go to our tasting. But Garrett, is there any woman in the history of brewing or distilling, particularly here in Washington, but anywhere, that we just should have in front of mind when we think about women in the role of these industries?
Let me think about that for a few minutes. Well, can I name someone who is not in the brewing industry?
Are they important?
Yes, quite.
Okay, you can say it.
Yeah. Frances Willard, the first woman to get a statue in Statuary Hall, and she led for 20 years the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which shaped, even to this day, so many of our attitudes about alcohol. So a vastly progressive woman, and at the forefront of so many progressive causes. The WCTU pushed everything. It was just incredible. And 20 years she led the organization, just absolutely remarkable. We don't always agree on the question of alcohol, especially I think most of us here drink. But but she was a really, really important person. And if you're ever in Evanston, Illinois, so where Northwestern University is, her house is preserved there. It's a museum, and please go see it. It's really, really cool. She was such a landmark woman, and again, first woman to get a statue in Statuary Hall of Congress. So pretty cool.
So before we open up to questions, I would just say to either of you, if you could meet her today, what would you ask her?
Why don't you drink?
I think she was clear on that. Rachel?
That's a great question. I don't know what I would ask her.
We could contemplate that.
Yeah, I'm going to give it a thought.
Okay, think that through. So, Carmen, are you out there with that microphone somewhere? We can take a few questions. Oh, we're over here? Okay, great. So I guess before questions, I always say please try to have whatever comes out of your mouth end in a question mark. Not too many just long statements, actual questions for our panelists. And again, when we stop taking questions, it's so that we can repair the tasting stations, and everyone will be there to talk more about history, about the distilling processes, which we didn't talk too much about in terms of how bourbon, rye, and beer are actually made, which the lady is going to explain to you in great detail. And any other questions you have, but let's take a few open here now.
Hi, thanks all for taking time to talk with us and for opening your establishment to us tonight. A few years ago, I was at a museum up in Rhode Island, and they were doing this exhibit on what Prohibition did for socialization between men and women. And I apologize if you spoke to this a little bit before I came in. I was having a hard time peeling myself away from the bar. But but it was really fascinating to me that the restrictions that were placed upon consuming alcohol frankly broke down in the portrayal that this particular exhibit gave barriers between men and women, for instance, drinking together. That they would maybe have to always recede to separate rooms after dinner in private residences, because that's where you would normally drink. You weren't necessarily going to bars. And that ended up actually sort of forcing men and women together to socialize in environments with alcohol. And I don't know to what extent any of you have any experience with that, but it always stuck with me, and I thought it was really interesting and what it means for all of us now today.
Yeah, it's absolutely true. Women were women were not really allowed to go into saloons before the bar, before Prohibition, except to go through the side entrance to pick up a supply for her husband. That was it. But during Prohibition, women start entering the speakeasies and demanding equality. It's a really remarkable time. Again, because it was illegal for everyone, so therefore women could equally break the law. And I think, yeah, seriously. They had the vote. It's a remarkable era. And once Prohibition ended, that did not change. Women had to earn their place at the bar, and they kept it.
What did you want to be when you grew up, when you were under the age of 10? And what was it that made you segue into your current careers? Like, what happened between extractive industries and distilleries? What was that critical turning point?
I guess maybe that first part is directed towards me. I grew up spending my winters on my grandparents' maple sugaring farm. And for those of you that have ever done any home brewing, once you have sugar, you're pretty close to having alcohol. So turning maple sugar and maple syrup into alcohol is pretty easy. I would say when I was young, I really, really wanted to be a fireman. I don't know anybody else, but big trucks, loud noises, cool outfit. But I also very much love cooking and making things with my hands. So my time in the extractive industries was really all about sustainability and trying to reduce waste. So working with mines to identify waste streams and turn them into something else. And at its core, distillation and brewing are always about resource efficiency. It's about taking bumper crops from agricultural communities, taking something that would go bad, condense it down into something that could be preserved and movable and saleable. So I see them as very similar.
When I was younger, my parents still make fun of me for this, because people would ask me, what do you want to be when you grow up? And I used to respond every time, I want to be a CEO of a really large company. And I had no idea what industry, what it was going to be. That would be my response. That's not what happened. I'm not a really large company. I wouldn't even necessarily describe myself as a CEO. I could, but Emily would probably nudge me because she does more of that for the company. Prior to opening Denizens, I worked as a senior policy advisor at the Small Business Administration. I did a lot of work on economic development. I did a lot of work on the Affordable Care Act and how it impacted small businesses throughout the implementation of that law. And so I was constantly around small business owners every day. And every day I would just get more and more inspired by them. And sort of, I want to take a risk. I used to want to be a CEO of a really large company. What am I doing here, right? And throughout all this, obviously in the background, I really loved beer. I homebrewed for a really long time. Little secret, I'm terrible at brewing beer. Don't ever drink beer if I've made it, personally. One of my business partner makes the beer, and I sell the beer. So that's what I was doing prior to it, but that was an interesting question. Thank you.
One or two more? Over here in the back.
Hi, I'm curious where you guys see the industry going and where you would like to see it going. Is it we need more women running more breweries and distilleries, or is it we need men to better understand how to interact with women running breweries and distilleries? Just what your vision is for the future of both of your industries and how you think we get there.
I would say both. I also think, as the industry grows, it's going to just naturally become more diverse in terms of ownership and then the folks who are involved. So I think that will naturally happen. I do think that when you have more women in the room, perspectives and decisions tend to be different if it's just men in the room. And vice versa, if it's just women in the room and there's no men in the room, you're going to have more homogeneous type discussions. So I do think diversity is the future of the industry, and I think that's a good thing.
That sounds right. I think I would. I would agree. More women in the room, but I think more women in all rooms where decisions are being made.
I think we have time for one more. There's someone, either one.
Hi, I was wondering how the state of the industries of brewery and distillery and the role of women in them compare internationally. So where are women here as compared to women in Europe or in other sort of major markets? Thank you.
I'm happy to go first. My exposure is somewhat limited, but certainly in countries like Scotland and Portugal and other countries that have a very strong wine industry, you're seeing distilling sort of track behind wine in the same way. And there are many more women, I think, involved in an equitable way in at least European countries. So Germany in particular is seeing a boom in their distillation because they're so well known for their brewing. And their equipment is superior. They're getting women involved in the actual manufacturing of that equipment in large malt houses. So some of my other mentors that I've met have all really come out of Europe, people that have really been in the industry for 20, 30, even 50 years, but coming out of your industry.
To be honest, I don't really have as much experience or exposure. I do know, just from reading a lot about the industry and paying attention to folks that other people pay attention to, there are a lot of women who are in power and influencers in the UK in the beer industry.
So again, we hope you enjoy drinks and food here, and we also hope and taste and learn, get some more educational materials at all of our tables. Like I said, this is the last New York Times Live event in Washington for this year, but please check our website. We have big events, we have small events, we have lots of different events. Look at NY Times Live for more. And I'd like to thank our panel. You guys were awesome. And thank you again, and enjoy the evening.
Once again, thanks to the New York Times for allowing us to share Thursday night's panel discussion on Women in Whiskey, Sisters in Suds with you. If you have comments, send them along and I'll share them with the panelists. And that's this week's WhiskyCast In-Depth, brought to you by Lagavulin. If you're looking for a great holiday gift, think about the Lagavulin Distillers Edition, with all of the Isla flavor of the Lagavulin 16-year-old and an extra boost from Oloroso sherry casks. Look for it at your local whiskey shop or visit malts.com for more information. The What I'm Tasting This Week department is brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery. Let's start off with the debut single malt release from the Cotswolds Distillery in England. It's bottled at 46% ABV. The nose is malty and sweet with notes of barley sugar, toffee, fudge, and hints of marzipan and almond oil. The taste starts off sweet with barley sugar, fudge, and toffee, followed by touches of clove and cinnamon that come alive and last through the finish, which is nice and long with a good balance of spices and sweetness. It's an excellent debut, and I'm scoring the inaugural release of the Cotswolds single malt a 91. I'll have more tasting notes in just a minute, but first, this week's tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, makers of Whiskey Advocate's 2017 Whiskey of the Year, the Elijah Craig Barrel Proof Bourbon. This 12-year-old bourbon was pitted blind against competition from around the globe and was consistently ranked number 1 by the magazine's testers. Meet the whole Elijah Craig family at heavenhilldistillery.com. Think wisely, drink wisely. Now, let's do a head-to-head comparison of a pair of fairly similar whiskeys. We'll start with the new Basil Hayden's Dark Rye. It's a blend of straight rye whiskeys from Jim Beam's distilleries in Kentucky and their colleagues at Alberta Distillers in Canada, along with a touch of port wine, and it's bottled at 40% ABV. The nose has notes of baked fruits with subtle spices, orange, clove, allspice, and berry cobbler, to be specific. The taste is dry, astringent, and wine-like, with red grapes, plums, figs, and hints of clove, ginger, and almonds. The finish is long and very wine-like, with rye spices. To be honest, to me it tastes more like wine matured in a whiskey barrel, and I'm scoring the Basil Hayden's Dark Rye an 84. Let's compare that, though, to the 2017 edition of High West's A Midwinter Night's Dram. It's also a blend of straight ryes, but is finished in port wine barrels. It's bottled at 49.3% ABV, and the difference is pretty clear from the start. The nose is spicier, with notes of clove, allspice, and ginger, but the fruitiness is more subtle, with hints of red grapes and berries. The taste is dry with good spicy notes of clove, allspice, and ginger, along with touches of plums and figs that add balance and complexity. The finish is long with subtle spices and touches of red grapes and plums. I'm scoring the 2017 edition of High West's A Midwinter Night's Dram a 91. Now, I need to point out that the Basil Hayden's Dark Rye does have a place. I think it might be an excellent whiskey to pour for a wine lover who's just getting started with whiskey. It'll give them a familiar taste while getting them used to whiskeys. But on its own, there's just something missing in the blend. This week's tasting notes are brought to you by Heaven Hill Distillery, and I'll be adding them to our searchable list of more than 2,000 whiskeys from around the world at whiskycast.com. That's also where you'll find links for WhiskyCast HD and the WhiskyCast Tasting Panel podcasts, the week's whiskey news, the calendar of events, cocktail recipes, and a whole lot more, including a complete archive of all of our past episodes. I hope you'll take a minute this week and leave some feedback or a rating for WhiskyCast on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you download your podcasts from. Those ratings do get figured into the search results that can help other whiskey lovers discover WhiskyCast when they're looking for content online. Of course, the easiest way to help other whiskey lovers discover the show is by telling them yourselves. Please share the show with a friend this week, along with the dram. You'll find us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and Tumblr at WhiskyCast. My email address is comments@whiskycast.com.
WhiskyCast. Brought to you by Redbreast, the definitive single pot still Irish whiskey. Those in the know Redbreast.
You don't need a special occasion to celebrate with something truly unique, but a personally engraved bottle of Johnnie Walker Blue Label can make any occasion special. Support for WhiskyCast comes from Johnnie Walker. Visit johnniewalker.com to find out more about engraving options near you.
WhiskyCast is a production of Cask Strength Media, copyright 2017, and comes to you each week from the charming, yet regrettably dry town of Haddonfield, New Jersey. I'm Mark Gillespie, reminding you that when you drink, please drink responsibly. Thanks for listening.